Terry Funk, more than just hardcore. Chapter 4. Breaking in. In 1965, as soon as football season ended in my senior year, I started wrestling in small towns on the Amarillo circuit. Growing up, there was never any question that I wanted to follow in my dad's footsteps. I had a couple of matches, one with Jack Kane, my uncle who had been the substitute football player for Boys Ranch. These were supposed to be warm-up matches, to help get me used to things, but these were little towns, and wrestling in front of 150 people didn't really get me used to the Amarillo audience. My dad wanted me to use the spinning toe hold as my finish hold, just as he had done. I don't know if Dory Sr. invented that hold, but he certainly was the one who popularized it. The only other person I knew who used it as a finishing hold around the same time was a wrestler in Oklahoma named Wayne Martin. The decision for my brother and me to use the hold was an easy one. It was over, and we weren't. For something or someone to be over, the people had to believe in it, or believe in that individual. Here's an example of how over a hold could get. In the 1960s, not long after I started wrestling, we had a guy come in from Kansas City. He wrestled as the Viking, and used the hook as his big finishing move. Now the hook was nothing but an imaginary nerve hold, but his opponent sold it like it was torture. Well, the Viking was driving home one night, but pulled over after he saw a guy fighting with a cop on the side of the road. It looked like a traffic stop gone bad, and this guy was pounding the hell out of the police officer. The Viking got out to help. Before the officer got hurt, he ran up and started to pull the guy off, but the guy turned around and recognized him and gave up, right there on the spot. He was screaming, "Oh God, no. Please Viking, don't put the hook on me." It's amazing to me how people never get a hold over anymore. All you have to do is put a hold on, week after week, and if the guys scream, holler and give up, before you know it, people recognize it as the culmination of the match. Baron von Raschke used to get his claw hold over with the people in a spot where he didn't even put it on his opponent. He used to do a spot where he'd lunge with the claw, but his opponent would move, and von Raschke would have to pry his claw hold off of the turnbuckle. That was one of my favorite holds in the business. His claw hold grip was so strong that he couldn't make his own fingers let go of the turnbuckle. And the people believed in that. They believed he was truly unable to release the turnbuckle. What was it he had, that he could get away with doing something so absurd? In Japan they got the Japanese armbar over so well that the people screamed when someone did it. Well, the armbar's a whole lot harder to get onto a wrestler to cause real pain than what the Japanese viewers think from watching those matches. My first match in Amarillo was against Sputnik Monroe. Sputnik was a great heel, but he didn't feel like giving too much to a kid having his first match. He led the match, and every time I started to look strong, he would say, "Okay kid, that's good. Now let's get back down on the mat, and I'll get this hold back on you." Also, I was gassed, just exhausted, early in the match from nerves. In fact, my nose started bleeding. I was doing everything he said, and he was guzzling me until my dad ran down to ringside. My father yelled, "Goddamn you, you dumb son of a bitch, you're letting him eat your ass up. Get up off of your goddamned ass and do something or I'll beat your ass." When I heard that, I jumped up, hit some moves quickly and pinned Sputnik, but Dad had some more choice words for me when I got back to the locker room. Sputnik was a great heel, but perhaps the top heel in Texas, and almost anywhere else he wrestled, for much of the 1950s and 1960s was Duke Hyomika. The irony was that Duke was a hell of a nice guy when he wasn't incurring the wrath of wrestling fans everywhere. I would run into him again in Florida. I had a few matches under my belt when I had some talks with Bud Grant about playing pro ball in Winnipeg. They offered a contract paying $12,000 a year. I also went to work for Vern Gagne in the AWA up there. I got on AWA television and, in my first match there, had Dennis Stamp as a partner against Larry Hennig and Harley Race. Well, they knew my father and liked us. We went out there, and those guys made me look like $1 million, and I didn't know jack shit about the business. If anybody could wrestle a broomstick, they could, because they did it with me. Then Vern sent me to Denver to wrestle Butch Levy. Butch was an old fart, tougher than nails. I thought I was going to do all this shit I did with Hennig and Race. They told me I was going 12 minutes, but that night I found out that 12 minutes with Butch Levy was like 12 days. I came out of that ring thinking, goddamn, there's something wrong with me. I ain't as hot as I thought I was. I got so depressed about the match that I went right up to the hotel and went to bed after having a couple of beers with another wrestler, Silento Rodriguez. When I left Amarillo, my father told me, "Now Terry, I don't want you going and getting goofy-ass drunk up there. I want you to mind your P's and Q's. You're working for Vern, and I want you to act like a businessman." Well, this was the night he decided to check up on me, and he called my room. Unfortunately, Silento and I got our rooms mixed up. I ended up sleeping in his room, and he ended up sleeping in my room. Even more unfortunately, Silento Rodriguez couldn't talk. He was deaf. He could feel the phone vibrate though. He reached for the phone and finally got it. And he said, "Hey ho. Hey ho." My father said, "Terry. Rooma bubba. Terry." Silento hung up, and my old man was hot at me. The next time he saw me, the first thing he said was, "God damn it. I told you not to get drunk. You act like a nut, and then you hang up on me?" I explained it, and he finally believed it wasn't me who hung up on him. The football deal didn't work out, though, and I soon came back home. It was a while before I understood what I needed to do to draw fans to the arenas. Dick Murdoch and I wrestled in a main event in Abilene when he was a rookie and my career was still very young. I'm sorry to say we did not continue the Funk Murdoch tradition of sellouts our fathers had started. We drew about 450 people and were going all out, to a 1-hour, time limit draw. We thought that would really bring the house up next time, because we had people standing the whole time we were out there. Next time in Abilene, we drew the same 450. The reason was, we lacked maturity. We knew what to do, yet we looked like a couple of kids out there, instead of 2 seasoned pros. I still had a lot to learn. In 1966, I left Amarillo for a place where I would do a lot of learning, Florida. Sputnik was in Florida when I wrestled there in the second year of my career. Not long after I arrived, Florida promoter Eddie Graham was having some problems with a Puerto Rican wrestler named Don Serrano, because Eddie was running shows in Puerto Rico at the time, and Serrano was starting to run opposition there. Eddie told us, "Sputnik, I want you to beat the shit out of him, and Terry, you just stay in the corner." "Okay, Mr. Graham." Serrano was still working for Eddie at the time, because Eddie's was the only TV wrestling running in Puerto Rico then, and he didn't think Eddie knew about his plans to open up his own full-time office. But Eddie did know, and since Serrano had given notice, his last chance to get him was in a tag match. The match was Serrano and me against Sputnik and Rocket Monroe. The idea was that if he got his ass beat on TV and looked bad, he wouldn't do any business down there, because people would see him as being unable to compete with top stars and be a champion. "There's just one thing, boss," Sputnik said. "I can't just go in there and do that to a guy without telling him it's a shoot beforehand." "Well," Eddie said, "I don't give a damn how you do it. Just make sure you do it." "Okay, boss, I'm going to tell him first." "Okay, Sputnik, you just make sure you kick the shit out of him." We had the match, and at one point, Sputnik had Serrano down on the mat. Sputnik got up, yelled, "I tease a shoot," and kicked him right in the head. Sputnik stepped back to make sure Serrano wasn't going to get back up, and when he didn't, Sputnik goozled his ass but good. Sputnik was a big white guy with a bleached streak in his hair and a tattoo of a cherry just above one of his nipples. Below the cherry were the words, "Here's mine. Where's yours?" Sputnik always liked running with black people. A few years after my first Florida trip, Sputnik came back to work for us. One night, we were in Amarillo, and he wanted to go to a black bar. He ended up getting so drunk that he told us he was going to sleep in the car. We came out a little later, and there was no Sputnik. We figured he got a ride home, and so we took off. What we didn't realize was that he had gotten mixed up and climbed into the wrong car to fall asleep. A black woman got into her car to get home, and she was driving down the road when he sat up. She looked in the mirror, saw Sputnik sitting there and ran her car right off the road. The cops arrested Sputnik, so we had to go get him out of jail. I also worked several matches with Ron Garvin, an excellent wrestler who was just starting out, and with Bill Dromo. Dromo was probably the most temperamental guy I ever met, but what a worker. Luckily he took a liking to me, and we had some unbelievable matches. One thing I'll never forget during this time was a match in Lakeland, Florida. It was Bronco Kelly versus Bob Nandor. Those two had, quite possibly, the worst match I've ever seen. It was one of the first matches where I ever saw all the boys come out of the dressing room to watch. That was the only thing that was going to get the boys out to watch. You really had to have a true stinkeroo going to get the boys out of the dressing room. Eddie Graham had been a partner of Art Nielsen under the name Rip Rogers. That was what he was doing when Art and he came through Amarillo in the late 1950s. He ended up buying into Florida the same way my father had in Amarillo, and he took the same approach that my father took in Amarillo and how he promoted and how he became a part of his community. I think he saw something that was successful for my father. My father's mentor, Cal Farley, once told him, "Dory, to do great things in here, you have to do good stuff for the people who live here, and if you do, they can't knock you or hurt you." My father lived by that rule. He did a lot of great things for people for no money. When he was out at the boys' ranch for years making $110 a month for running the thing, He loved what he was doing, but people also appreciated what he was doing. The community really accepted him for that. It was like arms were open to him at every corner, business-wise and otherwise. I think Eddie saw that, because when Eddie went to Florida, he also set up a boys' ranch, and it was successful for a while. He was also very active in the Florida Boys Ranch and would visit burn patients in the hospital. He did a lot to build goodwill in that area. Amarillo had been built on a great deal of wrestling, and Eddie also saw the success of that. He built Florida on great wrestling with guys like Don Curtis, Hiro Matsuda and so many others who were selling the product as real. Eddie had a great mind for the business and a great feel for the fans. Eddie did not have a great deal of formal education, but he was a very self-educated person. He could fly airplanes, or captain a boat anywhere he wanted to. He was very much a self-made individual. Eddie had a great mind for the manipulation and continuation of what you would call storylines today. Back then we just called it being a manipulator, not in the sense that he was crooked or anything, but in the sense that he would manipulate what was going to happen from week to week, month to month, year to year. Eddie had a great feel for what the people wanted and were interested in. He was also very progressive. He broke the territory in on wrestling, but he progressed with the times and was very ahead of his time in terms of how he promoted. He was also fortunate in that he was in a growth area. Florida just grew and grew, and Eddie turned a lot of that growing population into wrestling fans. He used very complex finishes, as my father did, but don't get the idea that means that the finish is the match. He also understood how to make the TV the lifeblood of that area, and he really educated Gordon Soley. Many times I heard Eddie lecture Gordon about what to say and how to get an idea across. Gordon, who passed away in 1999, would have been the first one to tell you that, too. Eddie was also very influential in how I came to view the wrestling business. He was not only progressive in how he presented his angles and finishes, but he was also very heavy on the wrestling aspect of it. Eddie was very serious about maintaining kayfabe, the wrestling code of secrecy. Protecting the business was a big deal. Announcing with Gordon was John Heath, who was wonderful for describing holds and getting into the wrestlers' athletic backgrounds. Gordon and John were able to announce with such sincerity because they'd been educated to it by Eddie. Eddie was also able to get some great wrestlers into that territory just through the draw of the territory itself. It was the greatest place to live. It was a great life, the weather was beautiful, and everyone in the state knew you and treated you well. The location was so attractive, compared to say Minnesota, that Eddie didn't have to pay the boys what Vern Gagne had to pay them in Minnesota, to get them there. Amarillo was similar to Minnesota. Trying to get boys to come out to this little West Texas town, where there was nothing but sand, and not beach sand, like they had in Florida, it was pretty hard to compete with places like Florida. If you're running a place like Amarillo, you'd better have a lot more money for the boys, or they're not going to come. His son Mike became a very good worker after breaking in the 1970s, but Eddie looked at things a little bit differently than my father in that respect. Eddie would hold Mike back to a degree. He never tried to get Mike over as a superstar. Eddie was also a great mentor to me. Eddie gave me so much advice about how to work, took me under his wing and taught me what to do. I can't say enough about how much I learned from Eddie Graham. As I mentioned, another of my early mentors in the business, aside from my dad, was Iron Mike DiBiase, Ted's father. Mike was a star in multiple sports, including wrestling, at the University of Nebraska. He was a tough, wonderful guy who taught me so much about the wrestling business. He taught me to really understand the boys and the camaraderie there. He led me like I was a child in the ring, working 30 or 40 minutes, and working with him was the best education I could get as far as being solid and being believable. DiBiase was a master at getting heel heat, but he was really a highly moral man and highly intelligent. He was a great heel, which would be kind of surprising if you knew what a nice man he was. It takes a smart man to be a smart heel, because getting the kind of heat that makes people want to come in the ring after you is not easy, and he certainly could do that. Throughout my own career I felt I made a better heel than a babyface. To be an effective heel, however, you have to have the ability to be a great babyface, because you have to understand the psychology of what the people want out of you. The first time I really got a crack at being a heel, in Florida in 1966, I had already been a babyface in Amarillo for years. I found it was a wonderful way to go. I found that I really loved to make people dislike me. I really enjoyed making people believe I was a thoroughly rotten person, which I must have succeeded at, or else they wouldn't have tried to kill me every night. I also had some fun in Florida. We used to run Miami on Wednesday nights back then, in the same building Jackie Gleason used for his TV shows. They never locked Gleason's dressing room, so every Wednesday night, I'd go in there and piss on the toilet seat. And every week when I watched his show on TV, I would have a laugh to myself, because I knew that at some point that day, he had been sitting on my piss. Hell, that was my biggest claim to fame at that time. I was still in Florida in 1966 when my father's partner, Doc Sarpolis, passed away. Dad called to tell me he had bought the remaining shares in the promotion from Sarpolis's widow. "I want you to come back, Terry," he said. "Dad," I told him, "I'm making a lot of money here." "Well, figure out how much you're making a week, and I'll see if we can't come up with something better for you." I called him back after my wife and I figured it out and said, "Okay, Dad, I'm averaging $278 a week here." "Oh, I can beat that," he said. "Come on back." So I did, after I gave my notice. I wasn't leaving a huge hole for them to fill. I was a middle-of-the-road guy. I worked some with Wahoo McDaniel, a former NFL player and tough guy who had become a hell of a star, and those guys, but I was never a main eventer. Now the Florida territory almost always made a lot of money, but the boys didn't see a great deal of it. One time, early in my career, my wife and I were on a 15-foot boat, enjoying a day on the water. We were near the base of the Causeway Bridge that connected Tampa to St. Petersburg. We were fishing when all of a sudden head came this gorgeous, 55-foot boat roaring by, horns blasting. Eddie Graham waved at us as his boat went by us and I thought, maybe I'm in the wrong end of this business. I got to learn from some of the greatest promoters ever in the wrestling business, from exposure at an early age to not only my father, but also the likes of Eddie Graham and Vern Gagne. I also got exposed to Jack Pfeffer, who brought a new attraction into Amarillo in the 1960s. He had been a promoter in the Midwest using journeyman wrestlers and giving them names that were knockoffs of big attractions. When Nature Boy Buddy Rogers was the hottest wrestler in the country, he called a guy Bummy Rogers. He would use Whipper O'Connor since Pat O'Connor and Whipper Billy Watson were two of the biggest names of the 1950s. He had Hobo Brazil instead of Bobo Brazil. I guess he thought people would come to his shows thinking they were going to see the real stars. I don't think that worked out too well for him. By the 1960s he was bringing black women wrestlers from territory to territory. He had Babs Wingo and Princess Lumumba, straight out of Africa. And Amarillo ended up being one of those territories. Lumumba was actually this gal from Brooklyn, and he put a tin pot on her head and some chicken bones around her neck, and she became a princess. He'd bring her out on TV and explain that Princess Lumumba had a few words for the people. Our announcer would put the microphone in front of her, and she'd say, "Mama da baba doo doo ma luba baba la poo poo." And it drew. People came to see the African princess. That right there should show you how much times have changed. Let Vince try to pull some shit like that now. He'd have people picketing him at the arenas. Pfeffer had some strange habits. He believed in only using toilet water to comb down his hair. I don't know why, but it's the only thing he would use. He was always digging in his nose, too, and he'd wipe those boogers off into his hate. Why? Who knows? And he never spent a nickel on his clothes. He looked like the damned ragman of wrestling. Amarillo had some really good wrestlers at that time. Bull Ramos was a hell of a performer. He was Apache Gringo's partner. When my father came up with that name, Bull wasn't sold. Bull said, "What the hell does Apache Gringo mean?" My father said, "That's exactly what those fans are gonna say, and it'll create some mystery." Well, Apache Gringo never did catch on, so I guess Bull was right about that. My father also gave Gary Hart a new nickname. Gary had been Playboy Gary Hart, wrestling around the country, but when he got here, my father decided to rename him Gay Gary Hart. I guess my father just thought Gary was a happy individual. Gary and I were actually the ones in charge of driving Princess Lumumba and Pfeffer around. For whatever reason, whistling drove Pfeffer nuts. Once Gary found this out, he would spend the whole trip just whistling random notes until Pfeffer couldn't take it. He'd yell at Gary, in his heavy Polish accent, "God damn it, Eddie, you quit that goddamned whistling. It hurts my ears, Eddie." Gary would stop for a while, but sooner or later, he'd forget and start whistling again. He drove poor Pfeffer nuts. My father was a great teacher to me, but I was also fortunate to be around some of the guys we had in Amarillo. One I learned a lot from was Ricky Romero. I made a lot of trips with him, and he was as good a Mexican wrestler as there was in the United States in the 1960s. Cyclone Negro was another very talented individual and one of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet. He always kept his body in great shape and had one of the greatest, most expressive faces I've ever seen. I mean, he had the greatest face in the business. It made him a perfect heel. He wasn't hideously ugly, he just looked like one mean son of a bitch. And we brought Stan Hansen back in after he came back from a season with the Detroit Wheels, a Continental Football League team. He ended up hurting his knee and decided wrestling full-time would be a safer way to go, so he came back down. We told him we were putting together a great highlight film to plug his return. We set it up on a monitor as if this was what was going out on TV, but it was only for his benefit as a rib. It was a package of every moment where Stan had gotten the shit kicked out of him. He got punched. He got slammed. We had some goofy music set to it, and every few seconds this big, booming voice would come over the music and say, "Stan Hansen, former Detroit Wheel." Then, it would have him just getting the hell pounded out of him some more. Stan Hansen, former Detroit Wheel. Boy was he pissed off. "You're not going to show that, are you?" He took a while to calm down, even after we assured him it was a rib. Stan actually came pretty damn close to having his wrestling career ended not long after that. We were in El Paso, just goofing around at the hotel pool, and he was trying to throw me in. I got lucky and threw him in, which got him really pissed off. He got out and came running after me with his clothes soaking wet. I was on the other side of the hotel door, and he was so ticked he kicked through the glass door. When he pulled out his foot, it caught the glass and cut his Achilles tendon right in half. Stan was a tough guy, and he thought he could come right back in 5 weeks, after having it sewn back up. Well, all that did was tear it up again, and he ended up out for about 3 months. He never did blame it on me, though, and I was always mighty glad about that. One of the toughest guys was Amarillo's Mr. Wrestling. Tim Woods, an accomplished amateur wrestler, was Mr. Wrestling in much of the country, but in Amarillo the mask was worn by Gordon Nelson. Gordon was a hell of an amateur wrestler. He taught a lot of guys the sugar hold, a type of chokehold that could incapacitate a man. I knew the sugar hold before I knew Gordon, but I didn't want him putting it on me, that's for sure. As Mr. Wrestling, Gordon would take on all comers, with the deal being a cash prize for anyone who could last 10 minutes with him. I always admired anybody who did those open challenges, because you don't just get marks out of the crowd, you get some tough guys. You never know who you're in there with. Another guy who did that was someone I got to know much better in San Antonio years later, named Keith Frank. Keith gained more fame using a name I gave him, Adrian Adonis. Adrian was not a classically trained amateur wrestler, but he was incredibly tough in his own way. His deal was a $10,000 challenge, and he handled it well. Adrian would con the challengers. He'd push them into the ropes and then let them push him into the ropes. He'd smile at them, and as soon as their guard went down a little, he'd deck them and down they'd go. Leigh Thornton was the guy who brought the European style to Amarillo, and he was a hell of a guy. I know it might sound like I'm saying hell of a guy too much, but it's really the truth. These were good people. They were all friends. Hell, they were part of the family. My dad also had an actual part of the family helping out behind the scenes. Jack Thornton, the uncle who had slipped into that football game for the boys' ranch, had originally come to Amarillo to help my dad out there. Soon after, he started refereeing and integrated himself into the wrestling business. He and my Aunt Eleanor ended up splitting up, and Jack married a woman named Barbara, who had been married to a man named Brom. When they married, Jack adopted her son, Billy. Billy Brom changed his name to Billy Thornton. Even after his divorce with Eleanor, he worked for Dory Sr. and helped with booking, or paperwork, or whatever needed to be done. Later he went to work for the Sheik in Detroit as a booker. Believe it or not, Detroit was the premier territory in the country at that time. Detroit was doing $100,000 houses before anyone else had heard of a $100,000 house. They were drawing even more money than New York for a while. The Billy Thornton I knew was a strange kid. When he was 12 he stole a car. He was driving around town, and when he got caught, they thought the boys' ranch would be a good place for him. They took him out there, and that was where he stayed until he was 18. After that he went to one of the Amarillo TV stations and became a cameraman. And he was still a goofy bastard. He would switch around the numbers on the weather map so the weatherman would be there saying, well, in Amarillo today it was 94 degrees, when it was actually 49 degrees. I went years without hearing from him, until I went out to California in the 1980s looking for acting work. There was a big casting agent out there who called me in to read for a part in some TV movie. After I read, she said, by the way, Billy Bob, the fellow who wrote this, says he's your nephew. I said, Billy Bob? I don't know any goddamn Billy Bob. She said, Billy Bob Thornton. I thought and finally said, yes. Yes, I know who that goofball is. He stole that car. Yes, I remember. Well, Billy Bob was apparently directing, too, so that was the last I heard of that project. Later I played a small role in another movie he was working on, Friday Night Lights, and we were on the set together. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and we both acted like we didn't know each other. Amarillo was also where I encountered a really good tag team, Kurt and Carl von Bronner. Carl was a very smart guy and became a spray pilot after retiring. Kurt was a very dedicated professional. He was working for us when he got word one night that his mother had passed away in Germany. He went ahead and worked right on through it, fulfilling all his shots before going back there. It wasn't easy on him. Kurt von Bronner was the man who taught my brother how to use the forearm. Kurt could throw a forearm check better than anyone back then. The von Bronners proved to be more than teachers, though. They were also barbers, at least in one angle we did where they cut my hair off to build up a feud with them against Junior and me. Back then it took 5 weeks for the tapes of the shows to make it to all the towns in the territory, in what we called bicycling the tape around. This meant I had to cut all my hair off for 5 weeks, so the people who saw the tape of the haircut show last would get to see a bald Terry the next time I wrestled there. Of course, the people in the first towns where the show aired got to wondering, damn, isn't his hair ever going to grow back? I also remember Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson coming in and just doing fantastic. Pat wrestled in Amarillo as Lord Patrick Patterson, and I had some great matches with him. Ray Stevens was one of the greatest characters I ever met in wrestling. Ray and I did rodeo together for a while in the early 1980s. One night we were driving back from a rodeo show, and we would always shoot the shit. This night I guess we ran out of bullshit, and we got quiet in the car. I thought for a minute and then said, Ray, what would you do if you had $1 million? He said, as honest and truthful as he could be, I'd play a whole lot harder. And he meant that. I don't know how many times I was in a bar with Ray Stevens, and he'd ask me to borrow $50 or $100. Once I gave it to him, he'd set it on the table and buy drinks for everyone sitting at the table. He didn't care if it was his best friend or Joe Blow. He'd buy drinks until that $50 or $100 was gone, and he always paid me back. Ray was an unbelievable worker. He could do anything. One of our top hill teams was the combination of Black Gordman and Goliath. They came to us for a few periods after making their names on the West Coast. They were probably the ones who spearheaded the movement of Mexican wrestlers coming into the United States and being successful. When they were here, they were introduced as being from Mexico, but when they were in Los Angeles, they made the ring announcers say they were from not Mexico, but New Mexico, and all those Hispanic fans would go nuts. There's something I think a lot of guys don't realize about that generation of wrestlers: they could really wrestle. We have better athletes in wrestling than we've ever had, but we had more wrestlers back then. Heck, when I first got in the business, having amateur skills was almost a prerequisite. At least 50% of the guys then had some kind of background in amateur wrestling. While I learned a lot about wrestling from the pros I worked with, I was also about to have a whole new learning experience on my hands. In 1967, Vicky gave birth to our daughter, Stacy. I took one look at this little thing and knew my life was never going to be the same again. 4 years later, my life changed again, when my daughter Brandy was born. One thing that didn't happen too often, except in Amarillo, but was always a thrill for me was when all three Wrestling Funks Sr., Jr. and me would wrestle together. Dad still wrestled periodically, and when he did, it was automatic box office. It was tough working with my father, because you always knew who was in charge. Still, it was a real pleasure, not just because he was my father, but because I got to be in there with someone who had such a great sense of the people in the audience. He had great ring psychology. I can't remember him ever having the same match twice, and my brother and I both learned from him. As many times as Junior and Jack Briscoe wrestled for the world title, I don't think they ever had the same match twice, and I have never had the same match twice. I think that's a creativity that's lost in the business. I can't ever recall sitting down and talking to Pak-san, Hiro Matsuda, or one of those guys about even one high spot before a match. You did it in the ring. You would have a finish and that was it. The rest of it, you did by feel. You've got to dance, and today dancing is all but gone. I was learning from my father and from people like Mike DiBiase to fully believe in what I was doing in a match, or while cutting a promo, an interview of a wrestler, aimed at hyping an upcoming match. When I was a babyface, I truly loved the fans and would go to the extent with fans that you'd see few people go to, because I realized what they did for me. Yet, and this is where the foggy part comes in, when I am a heel I truly hate the people. My brother would continually get mad at me. He'd say, hell, you don't come back down for 10 minutes. And I didn't. As a heel, I didn't just walk into the arena. I was the heel before I even got there, and don't even ask me when that transformation took place, because I don't know, but I think that is the lore for me of the business, that I can immerse myself in what I'm doing. When I get hit, I am hit. When I show being hurt, I am hurt, and when I am beating somebody up, I am beating him up, and I don't mean that I am out there throwing potatoes, legitimate, full force punches or kicks. Junior and I worked together in a lot of tag team matches over the years, though. He also learned some, I think, from Mike DiBiase, but he also picked up things from a lot of people, incorporating a lot of styles into his own work. I think he learned a lot about psychology from Johnny Valentine. I thought that being a second-generation wrestler helped give me a good foundation for what to expect in the business. It didn't seem to work that way at first for Johnny's son, who wrestled for us as Johnny Fargo in the early 1970s before becoming Greg the Hammer Valentine. Greg was 18 or 19 years old when he started for us and was never happy with his money. One day they were passing out the checks. His was about $500, and he wasn't happy with that. Well, this was a surprise to us, because $500 for a week's pay in the early 1970s was pretty damn good, especially for a young guy. He opened up his check and started cussing up a storm, and I looked over and watched him tearing his check up. He threw the pieces on the floor and stomped off. I didn't do anything. Neither did my father, my brother, or Uncle Herman, another old police officer from Indiana like his father. Herman retired from police work and worked in the office at that time. We just sat there. About 5 minutes later, he walked back into the room, picked up the pieces, put them in his pocket and never said another word about it. But Greg was a good man deep down and a tough guy just like his dad. He had that way about him where I knew that he was always going to do all right for himself. He wasn't what you might call a loner, but you weren't going to get a phone call a day from Greg Valentine to see how you're doing. A lot of the guys were obviously tough, but some of the really tough ones might surprise you. What a lot of people don't realize is that my brother is a tough man. I think that's because he is a fairly quiet man. He certainly knew how to hook somebody. He was also a good football player and a much better athlete than I ever was. He could always run faster than me. We paid the TV station in Amarillo $500 to use their studio and shoot our show. Then we'd bicycle the tape around to the different towns. Our announcer was Steve Stack, who learned everything he knew about wrestling in Amarillo. He had been running a gas station. His co-announcer was Nick Roberts, the old Lubbock promoter. Nick was a former wrestler and the father of Nicola Roberts, who worked as a manager named Baby Doll in the 1980s. Some of the most outrageous characters we had in the Amarillo territory weren't wrestlers at all, they were the promoters of the towns. Chief Little Eagle ran Hobbs, New Mexico, on an old Air Force base. God, what a rat trap that place was. The closest thing to a shower in the building was a hose connected to a horse tank. Unfortunately, he never changed out the water in the tank, so the shower water got filthier every time it was used, because it just kept recycling through there. Little Eagle walked around with a .45 pistol sticking out of his waistband, and he'd wave it at anyone he got mad at. Our Albuquerque promoter was Mike London, and he had TV there Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. We'd have to leave Amarillo at 6 a.m. to get there. He had a one-day promotion. We'd go on TV that morning and beat the NFL and everyone else for viewers. Seriously, wrestling was the top-rated show there for years. Then, at 5 p.m. on Sunday he'd open up the box office and by God, they'd better be out of there by 9 p.m. or 9:30 p.m. Mike did his own ring announcing, introducing all the wrestlers, but he had some problems on the microphone. Sometimes Mike would forget who was in the ring, or who they were supposed to be. One time we had Nick Roberts out there under a mask as Mr. X, to fill in for a no-show, and London introduced him saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, in this corner, from parts unknown, Nick Roberts." About every 2 years, Mike would have a robbery at the box office. He'd come into the locker room with his shirt torn up and a story about how he'd been beaten up and the money stolen. He always seemed to have some extra money after those weeks, and then he got an insurance payment to cover the robbery. It was like Albuquerque had a big holiday once every 2 years called Mike London Day. Actor Ernest Borgnine came to one of the shows in the late 1960s. Junior and I were talking to him backstage. Borgnine was amazed at the size of the crowd and couldn't believe we ran the town every week. "This is really great," he said. He started to say something else, but Mike walked up to him and asked him, "Do you have a ticket?" Borgnine didn't. Mike asked, "Well, who are you?" "I'm Ernest Borgnine. I'm an actor." "But you don't have a ticket?" "No, I don't have a ticket." "Then get your ass out of here." The other Texas promotions were undergoing some upheaval during my first years in wrestling. In 1967, Houston promoter Morris Eagle died, and his assistant, Paul Bosch, took over the city. In Dallas, a mid-1960s promotional problem broke out between longtime promoter Ed McLemore and Fritz von Erich, who was trying to take over. Even though McLemore was the established promoter, my father backed Fritz because he and Fritz had always done good business together. Fritz talked to Dory Sr. about taking Dallas over before he even tried it. My father was really a great deal of help to him. He had a great deal of respect for Fritz, and he liked him. They were friends. Professionally, Fritz von Erich was an immediate box office draw wherever he went. It was heartbreaking to see what happened to his kids later on. Fritz outlived 5 of his 6 sons, and 4 of them had some kind of chemical problem. A lot of people tried to talk to Fritz about them, but I don't think he was capable of listening because of who he was. He was their father, and he believed in those kids no matter what. I know Jack Briscoe wrote a book stating that when he first came to Amarillo, Dory and I both beat him in a bunch of one-sided, 2-minute squash matches after playing up his amateur credentials on TV. I can't remember ever having a match with Jack that only went 2 minutes. I also don't think pumping up his credentials so heavily is something we would have done in Amarillo. Our audience was made up of people with names like Gomez, Martinez, and Hernandez, and those folks didn't give a shit about Oklahoma athletics. Jack Briscoe was a great wrestler, though. His brother Gerald was also a hell of a wrestler and was a good babyface, even though he had that big potato nose. Just kidding, Jerry actually has a lovely nose, really. We actually had the Briscoes in as a heel tag team for a while, and they were great heels. It was a unique feud in the 1970s. They would come to Amarillo and we would go to Florida as heels to face them. The funny thing was, we could use the tapes from one place and the other place. So the Amarillo fans got to see us as heels in Florida, and the Florida fans got to see the Briscoes as heels in Amarillo. It was kind of groundbreaking in a way, because it became more of an atmosphere like the Texas-Miami game in college football. Everyone had their local favorites. Junior and I also went into Georgia in the late 1960s, to battle the masked assassins Tom Renisto and Jody Hamilton. We had lines of people wrapped around Atlanta City Auditorium with people who couldn't get in. We did a hot angle with them on TV, with the Funks as the babyfaces. The Assassins were a great team. Everywhere they went they did big business. The Georgia crowd was actually very similar to the Amarillo fans. And the product was very wrestling-oriented. Vince McMahon's Worldwide Wrestling Federation in the Northeast was seen as the place where there was more showmanship than wrestling at that time. One thing about Amarillo, it was the Funks' territory, and that fact alone taught me a lot about wrestling. The best thing about being a performer in your own territory is that nobody can steal you, no one can take you out of there. But it has its drawbacks, too. From Vern Gagne in the AWA to the McMahons of WWE today, it can get easy to rely too much on yourself as a pushed character. The booker, or creator, needs to be someone who can live vicariously through others, so he can remove himself if need be. The excuse for a booker pushing himself too much is usually, I know I can count on myself not to leave the promotion without notice, or hold us up for more money. I'm not going to leave myself. It's the greatest excuse in the world, and it lets you push yourself forever. The demise of a great many areas over the years was that the wrestlers who owned them inserted themselves into too many top slots, and when you do that you're taking away an opportunity for your talent to prove itself, and it ultimately lessens the quality of what you're putting out. Still, knowing the other NWA promoters made a big difference in my professional life. No matter where I ever went, it was never, "Hi, how are you? What's your name?" I already had a relationship with every one of them, and that helped me tremendously.